Now, I want to talk a little bit here about the biggest lethal prescription drug epidemic we know about, opioids. And it's probably 25-30% of my book turns out to be about that, because it's a product that we know today that has caused so much havoc. Many of you may not know that the origin for this really goes back to the 1960s, when a nurse turned physician in England, Cicely Saunders, I write about her, she's a fascinating woman, wanted to found the modern hospice movement. She had the idea that people who were dying of terminal cancer should not have to die in hospitals. They should have the right to die at home. And she talked to other English doctors about this when she was a nurse, because she saw the suffering that went on in hospitals. And they said to her, oh, no one will listen to you. You're just a nurse. You got to be a doctor for us in the British establishment to listen to you. And so she said, okay. She went to medical school and became a doctor. It's a great story. And when she became a doctor, she said, okay, here's the problem. We know people are dying of these end-stage cancer. There's nothing we can do about treatment in many of these cases, but they have to stay in the hospital because of the pain treatment. We're giving them the equivalent of modern day, heroin or morphine, but it has to be distributed every 4 hours and usually through an IV. So her holy grail was to find a long-acting opioid painkiller that could be given to end-of-life terminal cancer patients. And if it could be given every 8 to 12 hours, by a pill form, they could be sent home with their families. She opens the first hospice in 1966 in London called St. Christopher's. Now, companies are looking in London and in the UK and in other places to try to find that long-acting opioid painkiller. And guess what? One finally finds it. It's called Knapp Pharmaceuticals. And guess who owns Knapp Pharmaceuticals in the UK? The Sackler family. It's their British subsidiary of Purdue Pharma. They come up with a drug called MS Continuous, which is a drug that delivers morphine in an invisible polymer wrapped coating that lets you give it every 12 hours. And that's the basis for hospice to really take off. And at that point, patients start to be able to go home, and that drug is used for end-of-life care for those terminal cancer patients. It's marketed in the US eventually by Purdue as MS-Contin. It's the long-acting morphine product, and it is an end-of-life terminal cancer pain. Now, Purdue in 1996 gets Oxycontin approved. Oxycontin is quite different. It's not really different. It's basically the same as the long-acting morphine, except what we now know is the company had done a couple of things. It had decided not to use morphine as the base drug, because they knew morphine had a bad reputation. It sounded like it was end of life. Too many doctors said, oh, morphine, that's terrible. So they decided to use Oxycodone, chemically very, very similar to heroin. So that would become the product inside. They would wrap it in this same polymer invisible coating that would give it up to 12 hours relief. Some studies showed it only gave 8, but they got approved by the FDA for 12. They got the FDA to say something remarkable on the label, although there was no evidence and no studies to prove that it was the case. Because it was distributed every 12 hours, only twice a day, Purdue said, by the way, we think that means you're less likely to be addicted to it. You're not using it every 4 hours, therefore it shouldn't be as subject to addiction. And there had been a small letter published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a few years earlier that said there was a very low risk of addiction. Of course, that was a letter. It wasn't peer reviewed. Nobody had studied it. It was actually based upon tens of thousands of hospital admissions in which people had used painkillers for 5 to 7 days, and only 4 had developed an addiction within that week. It wasn't a long-term study. But Purdue cited that. And the FDA said, all right, we think that's right. And they put on the label the fact that they thought it was less likely to be addictive, which is a remarkable thing, which convinced doctors when the sales team went out that it must not really be that addictive at all. And Purdue used that like a hammer. By the way, you should note, and talk about this inside the book, that the person who approved the drug Oxycontin at the FDA, Dr. Wright, Curtis Wright, and his assistant who helped approve it, they both went to work for, guess who? Purdue. You're right. They left the FDA for big money over at Purdue. That happens all the time at the FDA. It's one of the big problems, you're regulating a drug and then you go to work for the very drug company that you're regulating. So Purdue puts it out, and then the problem becomes the sales teams, because the sales teams go out and they say to doctors, hey, this is pretty good. This is available for just about everything that you want it to be available for. It's good for backache, not just good for end-of-life terminal cancer pain. It could be good for osteoarthritis, even though the studies had shown it wasn't good for osteoarthritis. Millions of people have that. It's good for all types of different pain that you could give it for. Now, They were so effective at lobbying, and with a group of doctors who were trying to reevaluate opioids, they actually were able to make pain, the treatment of pain, the fifth vital sign. What I mean by that is, you go to a doctor today and doctors ask you about blood pressure, pulse rate, temperature, your breathing rate. Those are the four things they always used to ask you about. Then Purdue and all the advocates for heavy opioid use said they should ask you about pain as well, because they should say, what's your level of pain today on a scale of 1 to 10? And if your pain was high enough, even if you didn't have any underlying condition, the doctor couldn't explain it, maybe they'd want to prescribe some Oxycontin to you. So over time, doctors came back and they said, by the way, we don't think Oxycontin's lasting 12 hours. We have some of our patients are coming back and say that it's only every 8 hours they have to reuse it. Purdue had a great answer. They said, oh, you know what? Yeah, your problem is you're not prescribing high enough dosage. You're probably only giving 20 milligrams. You give 40 milligrams, which was a much more profitable pill. They had 60, 80, and for a while, 160 milligram pill, enough to sort of kill an elephant almost. So go to a higher prescription, up the dosage. They had a thing called individualize the dose. They started a program. Individualize the dose was really a way to increase the dosage as well. So when doctors came back and said, by the way, you tell us that we think that this is not an addictive product, but we see a number of our patients behaving with looks like addictive behavior. Purdue had a great answer. They had a doctor who had given them a proposal for something called pseudo-addiction. Now, you couldn't make this up because it's such a crazy idea. But what it essentially said, the salespeople went off and told the doctors, look, you've got patients who seem to be addicts. They are clamoring for more and more of the drug. They want it all the time. They're willing to steal money to try to get it. They could be buying it on the black market where it's been diverted to. And the problem is, because they aren't really addicted, it's a pseudo-addiction. They need more of the drug. You need to up the dosage again. I know that sounds absolutely crazy, but believe it or not, doctors did that. In 2010, jumping up a little bit here, but in 2010, when a patent was running out on its early version of Oxycontin, Purdue rewrapped it in a slightly different chemical structure and came up with something called a tamper-resistant version. That sounds fantastic because now you think nobody's going to be able to abuse it, snort it, whatever else. It wasn't tamper-resistant. They marketed it as tamper-resistant, and doctors believed it was, and so it increased sales again, but it wasn't. And the thing that is most upsetting here is that some of you who are listening will have had friends who have become victims of opioids, have misused them, became addicted to opioids. I have a chapter in my book called You Messed with the Wrong Mother. It's about Marianne Skolek, who lost her daughter Jill in 2002, and her form of grief is to become a one-person warrior to go after Purdue. And at one point they try to smear her, and she says to one of the Purdue people, you messed with the wrong mother, and it's really true. Since I've published my book, I've met a number of parents, literally several dozen, who are in similar situations and also became real fighters. Ed Bish lost his son, Eddie Jr., and he's still at the forefront of fighting. Dan Schneider lost his son. Some of you may have seen him in HBO's The Pharmacist. Cynthia Munger, Barbara, so many of them that I have talked to who have lost children, who have turned their grief into fighting Purdue. And most of them who lost their children in the early 2000s were there when in 2007, the federal government charged Purdue, which was owned by the Sackler family, privately owned, with misbranding the drug, felonies, and brought all types of charges. The company pleaded guilty, and guess what they did? It's what I talked about before. They paid a big fine, over $600 million. They agreed that they had done all this improper marketing and misbranding, and these were felonies. 3 of the top executives, no one in the Sackler family, pleaded guilty. They had to pay big fines. They were out of the pharmaceutical industry. So in 2007, you think it's over. The government caught them, fined them. That's it, all the bad behavior. And that's the part where this story is so terrible, is that from 2008 until the current day is when Purdue Pharma and Oxycontin had its biggest sales. From 2008 on, they violated every part of the consent agreement that they had signed, and nobody came in and paid attention to what was going on with that fraud. From 2008 and on is when the company sold most of the $35 billion in gross sales of the drug pulled in. In 2015, the Sackler family made Forbes' richest families list with an estimated net worth of $14 billion. At the time, Forbes called them the Oxy clan. And I will tell you, this isn't a family like the family at Johnson & Johnson or Squibb or Lilly, which started a company that became a multinational company with hundreds of product lines. This is a one-hit wonder company. And what I mean by that is, you know, you hear of record of bands in the 60s or 70s, they had one-hit wonders. That was the end of them. They had a hit, we all heard it on the pop charts, we thought it was great, and we never heard from them again. Well, it turns out that's almost what Oxycontin is for Purdue. It's the one hit, becomes a massive bestseller, $35 billion in sales, almost all the profits taken out by the family. They become billionaires, $14 billion. Now, as this rages on, people are dying across the country. There's an epidemic that the press continues to talk about. What does Purdue Pharma do at the end of 2019? Purdue Pharma, the company that puts the drug out, says, oh, sorry, we're bankrupt. They file bankruptcy in New York. They sort of shop around for the best judge they can find, this judge in White Plains, New York, that they think is favorable in handling these big case bankruptcies, Judge Drain. They file their case there. And what does the Sackler family do? The Sackler family comes before the court and they say, by the way, we ran, those of us who ran, we were the 7 to 8 directors, we ran the company for all these years. We were the directors who directed how things were done. We were the people who took the money out of the company. We aren't bankrupt, but we want to be part of this bankruptcy in this sense. We would like to eventually reach a global settlement for the thousands of lawsuits and all the actions by the federal government and the state's attorneys general to settle all of these in this bankruptcy court. So maybe we could contribute some money to this. And as a result, we can walk out of this court scot-free with no liability, no civil liability, and no criminal liability as well. Well, there's precedent for this in the drug industry, of course, in the pharmaceutical industry. And that's the Robbins case, in which they had trouble before with an IUD that turned out to be very problematic. And when that IUD became the cause of all types of lawsuits, the company, A.H. Robbins, declared bankruptcy. This goes back 20 years ago. And the Robbins family, which owned it, went before the court and they were able to contribute to the final settlement. And they walked away from that process without having any further liability. The court allowed that to happen. And the very same thing happened here with the Sacklers, or is pending right now as I talk to you. And that's why this is so critically important. The Sacklers originally offered $3 billion to the settlement. Now they've upped it to $4.5 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. I don't mean to sneeze at $4.5 billion, but I guess if you have an $11 to $14 billion fortune, it's not that much. You walk away still with billions of dollars in Oxycontin profits. The judge is going to decide this summer whether to accept that or not. And right now, Congress has put in the House of Representatives, a bill called the Sackler Act, actually named after them, that would stop individual parties like the Sacklers or the Robbins family, who have not declared bankruptcy, from walking away with full liability discharges just by contributing money. And so I'm a big proponent of the Sackler Act being passed, and I hope that the Senate does something about it, and I hope it does get passed. You should write your senators and you should write your Congress people saying, please pass the Sackler Act. It's something you can do.